welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and I'm happy to welcome onto the show today Timothy Harvie. Tim, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure. So, for folks who don't know you, you're an associate professor of philosophy and ethics and the program coordinator of social justice and Catholic studies at St. Mary's University in Calgary. So, hello from the west coast of the United States up to Canada. I'm sure maybe it's a little bit of a grass is greener on the other side kind of thing right now, but I'm sure it's nice to be where you're at.
Well, I'm a little bit envious of the warmth that you have. As we're kind of 15 below Celsius and snow, and we're in the dead of winter here. So
Yep, that's a little chilly. Well, I wanted to talk about a handful of things with you today because you do a lot of really interesting work with religion ecology, religion and animals, especially that you get into some of the stuff that I really appreciate where people kind of dig into the philosophical foundations of some of this stuff. And there's a lot of ways to approach these issues, and some of us happen to like getting into that kind of conceptual work, which I really appreciate. So I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about kind of where you situate yourself in general in relationship to the field of religion ecology.
sure, my interests are pretty eclectic, and I've kind of been, uh, I guess both fortunate and perhaps ill-favored to be able to pursue just whatever interest crossed my fancy. And so over the course of my career, I've been rather diverse in writing on political economy, philosophy, theology, religious studies. And so now, uh, really focusing in on religion and ecology is borrowing and gleaning from those intersections. And so I'm interested in reconceptualizing the foundations of how we develop our political institutions in terms of the more than human world, and to move past and get beyond some of the grounding philosophical assumptions that are a part of our anthropocentric society, and gleaning from what we know of our own evolutionary connections with other species in the natural world, and as well as reconceptualizing the relational frameworks that we have. One of the things that uh, Linway Jr. commented on, and despite some of the other issues in his article, he says, despite being well versed in evolutionary theory, we essentially still don't believe it when it comes to how we conceptualize humans' relationship to the non-human world. And it doesn't really drive any of our uh, philosophical outlooks, our core religious or theological assumptions, let alone our political institutions. And so I'm interested in reconceptualizing that and offering a corrective, and then outlining what are, in fact, the political, economic, and social implications of that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that work. And I think it's hard to really sink in for people that like we really only just learned about biological evolution, scientifically within the last couple hundred years. Cosmological evolution, like 100 years since
Yeah.
the Big Bang Theory. So it seems like, yeah, we know all this. Like, no, we're still really letting it sink in, and still trying to figure out how to let the more than human world into our thinking, our feeling, our politics. Um, well, along those lines, you did this really nice book that you're an editor of that engages with this. It's a really great volume, Encountering Earth, Thinking Theologically with a More Than Human World. And who else? Trevor Bechtel, Matthew Eaton. You guys edited this together. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that book, because I feel like for anybody who doesn't know it, they're really missing out for personal enjoyment or for teaching. It's really a great volume.
Oh, thank you for that. Uh, Matt and I have known each other for several years. Through Matt did his PhD work at University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, and so we had some Canadian connections at various Canadian conferences and whatnot. And Matt knew Trevor, who then came on board with us to edit this work. And what we were interested in, essentially, it began with Matt and I essentially talking about our animal companions uh, in ways that, and just trying to describe just to one another, over uh, conversations, how they had changed our lives and our outlook and the impact they had. And it struck us that using these phenomenological frameworks uh, uh, has done so little work in theology. Derrida, of course, in his encounter with the cat and the animal that therefore that I am, as he narrates that, uh, broke ground in terms of the philosophical discussions, but there was very little done describing that kind of using our experiences for theological construction, even in animal theology, or even in the dialogue between theology and science, which we still use largely using doctrinal frameworks. And we wanted to invert that. And so we got a large group of scholars together from various backgrounds within a broad kind of Christian theological uh, purview. And, some wonderful folks like Grace Cow, Christopher Carter wrote the introduction, Laura Hobgood, among many others, Mark Wallace, Heather Eaton, and of course Kim Carfor as well, whose essay has quickly become probably the most popular one in the book, with her encounter with snakes. And we wanted to develop and narrate, first of all, what these experiences with the non-human world offer, and then use that phenomenological experiential material as an opportunity to reflect anew on our relationship with others. So for my own chapter in that book, it's with my dog Bones, who we rescued, who had likely some abusive experiences in his first 10 months of life. And it was 6 months to a year of immense challenge where uh, I say that in my chapter, I say that it's a common metaphor to say you are eaten out of house and home, and Bones did not grasp the concept of metaphor, where he would chew holes in walls, chew holes in my flesh, where he was just as likely to bite me as he was to want to play. And nothing seemed to ameliorate or ease his anxiety. And I was at a loss. I tried to train and control until one day, about 6 months in, I came home, and as our routine, and I just laid down on my couch, and Bones approached me, and I tensed because I was like, oh, what's going to happen now? And for the first time in our experience, and I believe the first time in his life, he simply leapt up onto my chest, licked my hands twice, and laid down. And remained there for the next hour, where I could feel his little heart beating, feel the warmth of his body, the influx of air into his lungs, expand and contract against mine. And then what was incredible to me is that immediately this became a daily ritual, and I describe it as a liturgy that expanded us both. And what was remarkable to me is that Bones was the initiator of this. He uh, he transgressed the boundary of canine to human. He was the one that risked in opening up this potential vulnerability, especially given his prior experiences. And it was him who I argue becomes a priest, who becomes kind of the sacramental conduit of transcendence. And so this is an example of how experience, at least in my experience, gave rise to an entirely changed worldview. And that's really what Encountering Earth is about. It was about encountering domestic animal companions, encountering them in lab and farm, in the wild, and then ultimately encountering cosmos itself. And Mark Wallace and Heather Eaton have each written beautiful chapters exploring that. So we kind of move geographically toward from the more intimate to the more expansive, and it was a real joy and an opportunity. A lot of the scholars who both wrote for us and who have engaged the book have talked about how wonderful it was to be vulnerable in our writing. As academics, we're not used to being vulnerable. We're not used to um, risking our kind of intimate selves. And that was really one of the more enriching aspects of this book for me.
Mm. Yeah, it's you're kind of learning from bones how to practice that kind of vulnerability, how to risk it, and yeah,
Exactly.
and it's such a pleasure to read, even if you're like not interested in theology at all. They're just such great stories that each author is drawing on from their own experience. And so, one of the things I like with kind of students who might not be interested in religion or theology, and you're kind of trying to show them how it's relevant to their life. These are such great stories for that because they're just enjoying a story, and then before you know it, you're learning theology, and you realize, oh, wait a second, there's more to the story than meets the eye, and helps you appreciate the kind of spiritual depth of our relationship to animals, and the way that theology can really impact our ordinary lives. So I don't know, really, really appreciate it. One thing I want to ask you, along the lines of how people like Mark Wallace, Heather Eaton get into this cosmic kind of perspective. What do you think about the tension between people who do like environmental work versus animal work, right? It's always been a bit of a thing, like your land ethics people versus your animal ethics people. And it seems like there's a tension sometimes, even in terms of like the American Academy of Religion. We have like the animals and religion unit, we have the religion ecology unit. And so obviously a lot of overlap, but historically some tension too. So I wonder, do you see that anymore, or do you feel like people have kind of resolved it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm not sure if people have resolved it. I mean, it's part of the age-old tension of acknowledging the individuality, the uniqueness of the animal that you encounter, versus kind of a biosystems sort of view. And the practical example that's often used is you know the issue of culling or transporting species for broader ecological systems benefit, or being confronted with the violence to the particular animal that you're encountering in that moment. And I feel that tension. I tend to focus on the animal because of my background and interest in notions of intersubjectivity, uh, notions from Levinas, Martin Buber, and others. Uh, but I think the tension is still there. I think people are beginning to try and find and explore ways to overcome them so that the tension is no longer irreducible, right?
Right.
So and this is part of where my work is trying to head now. I had an article that's coming out in Studies in Religion, Sciences Religieuses, in Canada, dealing with political lament. And I narrate an encounter with uh, an elk that was wounded, and recognizing as I was out in the Rocky Mountains, there's nothing that I could do but observe and grieve. And yet I could still acknowledge that eventually this beautiful elk, who is protesting her own inevitable fate in trying to keep up with her kin, would nonetheless nourish the coyote population, some foxes or carrion birds or others as she dies. But nonetheless, that doesn't lessen the grief of the individual elk as she's suffering and fighting her inevitable end. So I think the tension is there. I think where I'm interested in exploring, trying to overcome some of these tensions, is using intersubjectivity frameworks, using these phenomenological frameworks to guide political structures then. And so offering a politics of animals, a politics of plant life. And so I think there's avenues to do this. I think there are ideas that can be found in new materialism and other religious studies frameworks, Mary Jane Rubenstein, and others. I think historically, folks like thinkers such as Spinoza or Giordano Bruno offer guidelines for this. And even more recently, Miguel de Unamuno talks about the universe as the body of God and how tragedy is worked into this. And of course, this coincides well with much of the literature being written on the relationship between uh, evolution, biological evolution, and uh, species loss. Both how species loss was necessary for evolution, but we are now seeing anthropogenic extinction on rates that were previously unfathomable and are outpacing other extinction events. And so trying to weave these connections is a part of what I'm doing, whether or not that will overcome the tension, but I do think we can ameliorate it
Mhm.
and see some more profound connections between those two.
Nice. Yeah, those are great examples. Good examples of theorists that help us with it, but also that's a really poignant example with the elk. And I know you have a new book project that's kind of in the works right now that's dealing with some of these issues, and specifically be drawing on Maurice Merleau-Ponty and his approach to phenomenology. So I know it's early in the project, so you probably can't say too much. Or this is the best time to say stuff because no, we can't really hold you to it because the book's not done yet. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit. What's this project? What should we keep an eye out for?
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, the good news is that I can always take it back, I suppose, at this stage. It's really building on some of the work that I've been doing the last few years through articles and papers at AAR and whatnot, exploring the impact of Merleau-Ponty in developing an earthen public theology. Now, public theology is one of those sub-disciplines of theology that is aimed at using theological reasoning or motives to address public issues and public institutions. So it has its heritage, obviously, with Jürgen Habermas, but then, with David Tracy's famous threefold schema of the three different publics of academy, politics, education, uh, and it's proliferated since then to essentially explore different public modes of reasoning, opportunities for religion to take part in this. But all of these are two things, and there's two key issues that I find in public theology. One is that it addresses issues. And so this is the advantage of, for example, problem-based learning, where you are attempting to solve or offer a contribution to a dialogue around a particular issue and therefore make a meaningful contribution. But as a method, an issues-based or problem-based method also can lead to ad hocery. And it doesn't often address then some of the underlying uh, frameworks of assumption or presuppositional frameworks that are guiding it, and in fact, then perpetuating what I argue, secondly, to be an anthropocentric framework for public theology. And so I want to develop from Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, and especially his posthumous work in The Visible and Invisible, an account of the flesh of the world within an evolutionary framework and how this provides what Hernandez would call an ontological grounding for our public institutions. And so in doing so, it actually causes us to re-envisage what our political frameworks, our various public institutions offer, and in particular in terms of the political economy. And so I might, cite, for example, Catherine Keller's recent work in political eco-theology as an example of recasting how we think of politics. And I want to recast and think about an earthen public theology, one that's rooted and grounded deeply in our relationships with the myriad living creatures of the earth, and also view ourselves in continuity. And so I want to talk about a politics of animals, a politics of plants, and and really try and push back against an intransigent anthropocentrism present, as I believe it to be in public theology. and try and overcome this.
That's great. I'm really looking forward to that. That's some of my favorite questions to work with, and I really think Merleau-Ponty is still pretty underappreciated in theology and religious studies. Maybe because he wasn't very explicitly engaged in those kind of discourses, but he seems so relevant. And some of the really exciting things happening from other movements like New Materialism are still kind of just rehearsing what he was already saying, so many decades ago. So I appreciate you digging into that work. And Visible and Invisible, Jesus, such a beautiful book. So yeah, this is
Yes.
exciting, but you are still allowed to take all that back and change it all. And so we won't hold you to it. um, well, geez, I have one last question for you, a big question, I guess. Really, I always like hearing how scholars get into the work that they do. What were the practices or experiences or just life history that would lead you to do what's really strange work, right? Because like we're talking about this very entrenched problem of anthropocentrism, and like, well, how would you ever think to break out of that? It's such a big feature of our society and mainstream educational and economic institutions. Just everything about our world kind of reinforces that. So I'm always wondering what was something that kind of broke you out of that made you think, you know what, I want to dedicate my professional life to exploring these kinds of problems.
Yeah, I've always been intellectually curious, and in particular, I've been interested throughout my career in looking at issues of oppression, issues of political structures. Even I recall as a very young undergraduate in what seems like a former life, reading Gustavo Gutierrez's The Theology of Liberation and be setting, and it set me aflame. I was, it was the most compelling thing I had ever read, and knew that unless we had some sort of praxis oriented and praxis grounded approach, then systems of oppression would continue. And so this drew my interest into political theology originally, writing on Jürgen Moltmann and others, and looking at even some of Thomas Aquinas's statements on economics and justice, and ultimately embodiment. And it was this embodiment piece that really captured my imagination. But of course, that doesn't of itself help one leave the confines and the narrowness and I would argue the myopia of anthropocentrism. It really was, as I've said, it was Bones. Uh, Bones changed me in a way that I cannot fully express. And it was in this encounter with a living being with whom I was in a relationship and yet was wholly independent and unique from me. And that encounter opened my world to the potential of life. And what this offered was a desire and a longing to learn about the myriad living beings with whom we share this earth. And dialoguing with science was my first entrance point, looking at themes of biological evolution and how nonsensical so much of our theological framings were when viewed in light of evolution. Even in some of the very best dialogues of theology and science, people who have influenced me greatly. Nonetheless, so often the conversation with science would occur, and then the theology, and they would be parallel streams. I didn't see the real necessity or the impact one would have on the other. And I thought, well, unless we are going to talk about the real world, we actually need to have a fulsome dialogue where both conversation partners, science and theology, are changed, both are expanded, both are opened up. And then this occurs in, from my perspective, in the opportunities of giving philosophical description and theological description to the relationships that we have with with the non-human world. And Merleau-Ponty's account of the flesh of the world and the imbrication that we have, the chiastic relationships that we have with the earth itself is so generative for me, and it's rich with opportunity. And Merleau-Ponty wrote a long essay on the history of religion, and he begins to incorporate some of these ideas as both corrective and opportunity. And this is how I see my dialogue with Merleau-Ponty, as both corrective and opportunity. A corrective to some of our myopic religious visions, but also an opportunity to have a more fulsome account of our spirituality, our shared experiences as members of the earth. And even from the perspective of theology, much work is being done now, bridging Christian theology and animism. Mark Wallace's book, When God Was a Bird, is a beautiful example of this. David Clough's account of incarnation in his first volume on animals. Uh, People are beginning to have these conversations, and I'm interested in expanding these a little bit more to reconceptualizing divinity itself and humanity as participants alongside other species with divinity.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I love the kind of integral role that bones plays in your path, your transformation. I think it's one of those things people say a lot and you hear a lot, like, oh, well, our animals and our, non-human kin, these are our teachers. And people go, yeah, that's a sweet thing to say. And then you meet people who are like, no, I mean that quite literally. And once you tap into that, it never goes away. It changes who you are. And it's one of the most special things I ever hear from people when they're like, one of the best philosophers I ever met, my dog. I'm like, that's true. It's kind of a
Yeah,
cute thing to say, but 100% true. I know there's mystics who are like, I learned to meditate by watching a cat hunting a mouse because it stayed so still for so long. And these really are
that's right.
our teachers, right? Learning about them and learning from them. So yeah, I really appreciate that whole trajectory, like Merleau-Ponty and Bones as two very prominent influences. Um,
They're coming together. They're both going to get adequately cited.
yeah, I hope so. I'm sure in the acknowledgments as well. Well, geez,
Absolutely.
Tim, thanks so much for making time for us. I really enjoy talking to you. Really appreciate your perspective. We'll have to have you back on another time to explain some stuff that's going on politically, because I have no idea. And that's there's definitely a lot to be said right now for how politics and religion are colliding. So that'll have to be for another time.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, geez, thanks so much for being here, and thanks for everybody for tuning in. We'll be back next week with some more conversations for you. In the meantime, take care and be well.